whereas the 14th Amendment giving full citizenship to freed slaves passed in 1868 with 94% Republican support, 0% Democratic support in Congress.
The Democratic Party defended slavery, started the Civil War, opposed Reconstruction, founded the Ku Klux Klan, imposed segregation, perpetrated lynchings, and fought against the Civil Rights Acts of the 1950s and 1960s.
To your point, Antoine, I want to show our viewers the black voters and how they did turn out in large numbers for Biden, 87% to 12% for President Trump. We do know that President Trump was able to make some inroads with African-American males, but as you're saying, Antoine, Joe Biden owes a great debt of gratitude. His presidency, actually even his candidacy, to African Americans.
There's a contradiction here. The Republican talking point about Democrats being the party of the Confederacy and the party of slaveholders isn't a lie, but it's misleading without context, and context is what I'm here to provide. Last time I talked about the Republicans and their forebears, going back to Alexander Hamilton, as the Hamiltonians. This time I'll discuss the Democrats and their predecessors back to Thomas Jefferson as the Jeffersonians. Generally, the history of U.S. politics has been that the Hamiltonian side sets the tone and the Jeffersonian side reacts to it. The Hamiltonian story started with merchants who wanted protection from international competition and built from there. In broad strokes, the Jeffersonian story is the opposition to that, at least up until the Civil Rights Movement. But if I just left it at that, there wouldn't be a video, now would there? So off we go with...
Gotta be in Monticello, now the work at home begins.
Thomas Jefferson is emblematic of American history. On the one hand, he was everything your childhood history book said. A visionary thinker in political theory, author of the Declaration of Independence, and founder of the American liberal, and that's liberal with a small L, tradition. He was a strong philosophical mind who critically examined Christianity for the good and bad of it. He was also a slaveholder, had racist elements in his writings, and raped one of his slaves. Kind of harsh to start off with, but get used to it. It's common to the Jeffersonian line. Bearing this white supremacy in mind, Thomas Jefferson was otherwise the most democratic of the Founding Fathers, as the opposite of Alexander Hamilton, who was one step away from being a monarchist. His view of society was based on maximizing citizen participation in government as the main check against tyranny and corruption, and so could be called libertarian, though it would have been called liberal at the time because our capital L liberalism is a modern political term. He believed that free farmers, in charge of their own production, would be masters of their own destiny and so create a free society. This is how Jeffersonian democracy was focused around agriculture, because most of the citizens of the day were engaged in farming instead of in commerce or skilled trades. Citizen farmers didn't include slaves, and people who worked on farms but didn't own the land had a questionable position at this point. Different states had different rules about property requirements for voting, that sort of thing. The best way to define it would be eligible voters, and these were white men who were mostly farmers and mostly owned some property. The expansion of the vote, along with the War of 1812, helped change the idea of who the citizens were, however. Was the first turning point in the Jeffersonian story. It came at the end of the era of good feelings that I talked about in the last video, where the Democratic Republicans had become the single party in the system for about 8 years, but this meant the party of Jefferson lost its coherence. The election of 1824 was the first one where all white men, regardless of property status, were allowed to vote in all states. And it was also the first election with Andrew Jackson on the ticket for the newly formed Democratic Party. To repeat what was said in the prior video, there were 4 big candidates in that election, and nobody won a majority of electoral votes, sending the election to the House of Representatives. At that phase, John Q. Adams struck a bargain with Henry Clay, get the states he won to vote for Adams in exchange for Adams making Clay his Secretary of State. So Andrew Jackson, who won the most but not majority of electoral votes, was shut out. That this happened at all wasn't ideal. But it happened on the first all-white men election was a rallying cry for the populist cause that took root in the party under Andrew Jackson. That the nation's political elites had conspired so that the man who won less popular votes and less electoral votes won the presidency. And this anti-elitism was one of the major elements behind the party in this period. The second strain of Jacksonian populism was manifest destiny, or the general push to support settlers through expanding the United States westward and clearing the land for white habitation. Andrew Jackson fulfilled this himself through the Trail of Tears, a genocidal action to take up almost all Native Americans east of the Mississippi and move them out west. This was followed up in the Polk administration with the Mexican-American War and securing America's share of the Pacific Northwest, along with conquering the Mexican Southwest of New Mexico and what is now California, creating massive new lands for the party's base to settle. The third phase was the economic populism of the Jacksonian Democrats, which wasn't like how we think of economic populism today. Jackson opposed having a central bank, and so nixed renewing our central bank at the time, the predecessor to the Fed. He also favored a strict adherence to the gold standard and restricted the money supply for the commercial centers like New York and Boston. These anti-finance economic policies led to the Panic of 1837, which saw a sharp economic decline that took at least 5 years to recover from, helping to weaken the Democrats and strengthen the pro-business Whigs. The main issue that carried this phase of the party forward to the next was Western expansion. Specifically, the question of whether to allow slaves to be brought into the new Western territories. The Whigs, rivals to the Democrats in this period, were brought down by the slavery division, and while the Democrats at least survived the divisions of the Civil War era, the political upheaval still drastically changed the course of America. That led the country into the Civil War at 3 steps in quick succession, the first 2 happening at roughly the same time. Step 1, or Step 2 depending, was civil unrest in Kansas known as Bleeding Kansas, where a mini-civil war played out between competing pro- and anti-slavery governments in the territory. President James Buchanan not only failed to quell the violence, he actively sided with the slave owners, despite being from Pennsylvania himself, which helped earn his reputation as one of our all-time worst presidents. The second part was the Dred Scott decision, a Supreme Court case decided by Roger Taney, who had been appointed by Jackson, and was about a slave who claimed he had legally been freed when he'd been moved to Wisconsin, a free state, for a period of time. The Taney court disagreed, saying that Scott didn't even have the right to sue for his freedom because black people weren't citizens and could never be, even if freed. This was such a massive overreach that aggravated the slavery issue because the pro-slave side got cocky and over-assertive, much like you saw in Kansas. And yet again, James Buchanan had a hand in this, encouraging the Taney court behind the scenes to rule very decisively in an effort to put the slavery question to bed forever. Whoops. The last piece was the splitting of the Democratic Party in the 1860 election. At that point, the Deep South was already on the verge of breaking off from the Union. Despite getting everything they wanted in the Dred Scott decision, they still felt like abolitionism was a threat that they couldn't ignore. The main dispute was that the Southern Democrats wanted a law to force slavery into all the Western territories, while the Northern Democrats and the party as a whole backed the idea of so-called popular sovereignty. Slavery would be allowed where a majority of free voters approved of it, and barred where a majority of free voters opposed it. This meant that there were 2 Democrats on the ballot in 1860, letting Lincoln win the election, and Lincoln's win scared the Southern hardliners into kickstarting the Civil War. The Confederates had Northern sympathizers who were known as Copperheads. Anti-war Copperheads found sympathy in urban areas among the Irish-American community and other smaller immigrant groups. Irish immigrants gravitated towards the Democratic Party for a few reasons. Being victims of British industrialism in the UK, they naturally opposed the Hamiltonian drive to industrialize the US, and being hungry for land denied to them back in Ireland, they supported the Democrats' pro-Western settlement policies. The Civil War added in racism to this, with the Irish American community feeling like their lives were being put on the line for black people and a Republican government that they didn't support. This was a shameful start to Irish American importance in the Democratic Party, but this indeed is where it started. After the Civil War, the Democrats' political fortunes rallied on the opposition to Reconstruction, the massive federal effort to rebuild the South and enforce new racial equality laws. Electorally, Ulysses Grant managed to keep the Democrats at bay, but then in the election of 1876, they fought it to a standstill. The anti-Reconstruction governor of New York, Samuel Tilden, eventually crafted a deal with Rutherford Hayes, withdrawal of federal troops from the South in return for having the House of Representatives give Hayes the presidency. Democrats thus lost the war, but won the peace. Though in winning, their old power was still gone, and they wouldn't return to a dominant position in national politics for a long time. The Democrats had lost the Civil War, but then defeated Reconstruction in turn. From this point until the 1960s, Democrats would have a lock on the ex-Confederate states. But those states also saw their political importance sharply decline compared to booming populations in stronger Republican areas like the Northeast and Midwest. Growing industrialization in the Midwest in particular swung the political pendulum towards Republicans in a way that would last until the Depression. This is kind of an in-between period for the Democrats, having lost the powerful rallying cause of slavery, but not yet having found their later cause of economic populism. This is when the Democrats are really the least defined under any one banner and are kind of adrift, mostly bound by their opposition to the pro-business policies of the Republicans. So there's one unifying ideological banner. You could really only call it anti-corporatist. There were a few small issue areas, hence this section title. The temperance movement was beginning to gather steam and try to ban alcohol, but because whiskey and other drinks were more profitable to farmers than just selling the plain grain or corn on their own, that's where the rum part comes in. The second part was the strength of the Democratic Party among ethnic minorities in major urban areas. No longer just the Irish Americans, but also among poorer German immigrants or the new wave of Italian immigrants, and so the term Romanism was added derisively from anti-Catholic Americans. The rebellion part, pretty obvious. The ex-Confederates were still a significant part of the party even if they weren't in the driver's seat. The directionless aim of the party at the time actually allowed an older breed of Democrat to come to the fore. The only president the Democrats had in this period was Grover Cleveland, who was part of the faction known as Bourbon Democrats. This bourbon wasn't named after the liquor, but after the old royal house of France, think King Louis XVI, and symbolized that they were old-school Democrats, like the old Ancien Regime of France. Cleveland adhered to some old ideas about commerce and trade, being anti-tariff and in favor of strict monetary standards like Jackson and Jefferson before him. But there was another faction in the party that didn't take well to the tight money policies. Rain on the scarecrow, blood on the plow. The Bourbon Democrats lost power in the party after the Panic of 1893. Well, not entirely. Like everything else in these videos, the full story is more complicated. Two of the Democratic candidates after 1896 could probably best be described as Bourbon Democrats still, namely Alton Parker in 1904 and John Davis in 1924. For the most part, the party had moved on. The Panic of 1893 was also known as the Long Depression, and was prolonged because of the strict gold standard. Like Bitcoin today, the gold standard was designed to restrict the money supply, theoretically making it more stable. What it really meant was that things were good for lenders and bad for people with debt, like farmers, and that the government had less room to maneuver in times of economic downturn. William Jennings Bryan from Nebraska led the charge of a movement centered around angry farmers pushing for a so-called two-metal standard, like free silver, and he would be the Democratic presidential candidate in 1896, 1900, and 1908. But Bryan never won as president, so the populist movement wasn't as such successful at the highest levels. But it worked in tandem with the progressive movement on the Republican side to achieve a lot of the basic 20th century reforms. The title of this section comes from an activist named Mary Elizabeth Lease, who was an activist for labor, women's rights, support for farmers, showing there was a leftist element to this progressive movement. Although much of the party was still deeply racist and had some anti-intellectual strains in it too, like William Jennings Bryan was a representative for the prosecution in the Scopes monkey trial against the teaching of evolution. So it really represented a big tent populism against America's social and financial elite. The turn of the 20th century was also when the organized labor movement in the US, growing in mainstream popularity in the workforce, began to associate more and more closely with the Democrats. Though the Republicans had some pro-labor elements to them, the fact that the GOP was very solidly the party of big business as well meant that the Democrats were less conflicted about being pro-labor, and labor gradually latched on to that. This phase of the party also had only one presidential success, Woodrow Wilson, who was kind of a walking symbol of how complex the party was at the time. Wilson was an intellectual Princeton professor, born and raised in Virginia, and so had the old and new of the Democratic Party in him. The old meant that he was naturally pretty damn racist and actually pushed the party backwards on race issues somewhat, plus being a fan of the pro-Klan propaganda film Birth of a Nation. He was a genuine friend of white laborers, though, and passed a raft of reforms following more in line with Teddy Roosevelt than with Taft. He also helped found the modern international political order with his proposals for the League of Nations after World War I, setting the stage for how FDR and Truman would handle World War II. Wilson was the first step towards the Democrats becoming the party of labor, but the candidates of the early 20s, James Cox and especially John Davis, were throwbacks to earlier ideologies. It was in the late 20s that the party really hit its next phase.
St. Peter, don't you call me, 'cause I can't go. I owe my soul to the company store.
The Roaring Twenties were a bad time for Democrats, but then came the Great Depression. Herbert Hoover's response pretty much leaned into making the Depression as bad as possible, both in terms of the raw economics as well as in terms of increasing human misery. He let everything fail, thinking that liquidating the bad investments would free up capital and restart things. But this is both economically unsound and just really unpleasant to live through if you're not rich. This is what teed up Franklin Delano Roosevelt for a resounding victory in 1932, bringing Democrats along with him to a control of Congress that would last, with a few interruptions, for about 60 years, and solidifying the role of labor in the party. FDR was a middle ground on black rights, seeing them as valuable voters in the North, but deferring to the racist Southern Democrats on their home turf in the South. What this meant was that black Americans experienced a mixed set of outcomes from the New Deal. Social Security and the National Labor Relations Act were both tailored to exclude black workers, not by name, but by excluding majority black occupations like farmhands and maids. On the other hand, many alphabet soup programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps or the Public Works Administration hired black Americans freely and extended the same helping hand that they did to white people. These overtures to the black community were important in the North where they could vote, where Democrats needed an edge in regions that were historically Republican. When FDR died in 1945, he was replaced by Harry Truman, who had been seen as a compromise candidate for vice president between the liberal and conservative wings of the Democrats. The racists hoped that the man from segregationist Missouri would be returned to the Dems' shameful past, but thankfully that wasn't the case. Harry Truman cheated the hopes of racist Southern Democrats to the point that Strom Thurmond ran on a Dixiecrat ticket in 1948 in an effort to emphasize the Southern plank of the party, though this famously did not succeed. Truman quickly proved to be a reformer on race when he integrated the armed forces in 1950. Truman's deliberative step towards racial integration is where the party could properly be called social democratic, which as an ideology is the closest you can get to socialism while still believing in private ownership of business, by and large. But in general, Democratic leadership at the time was very practical and not particularly idealistic. Take Lyndon Johnson, for instance, who stonewalled civil rights reforms under Eisenhower and Kennedy because he wanted to win for his party and for his own personal legacy. He knew it was the right thing to do, but he also knew the damage it would cause to the Democrats, claiming that he had just delivered the Deep South to the Republicans for some time to come after he signed the Civil Rights Act in 1964. But sign it he did. The Democrats had delivered for Black America, and newly enfranchised Black voters in the South have remained loyally Democratic ever since, along with urban Black voters in the rest of the country, who've become a bedrock for the party. But bringing them on board cost Democrats badly in white working class support. This would be the last time the farm vote could be reliably Democratic, and unionized white workers also became softer in their support of the Democrats, though unions themselves remained powerful organizers for the party. This white lash against civil rights coincided with the growing debacle of the Vietnam War to badly divide and wound the Democratic Party. During and after World War II, previously isolationist Democrats had become committed to making the world safe for democracy, and saw their intervention as fighting for foreign peoples against tyranny, unlike the Republicans who were more defensive in their posture, seeing the Cold War as a defense of American capital and of our own way of life. But not all Democrats were on board with foreign intervention, with many liberals, especially young college-bound liberals, being opposed to the war in Vietnam. The sense that Americans were being sent to die in an unjust war boiled over in 1968, at the same time as the white lash against civil rights gathered steam, leaving Martin Luther King Jr. dead and many American cities in flames from the ensuing riots. This culminated in riots at the very Democratic Convention in 1968 and foretold the decline of the party's fortunes going forward. Richard Nixon, of course, won in 68, then cruised to re-election in 72 as the divided Democrats went with the anti-war Senator George McGovern, and he got beaten the second worst ass-kicking in U.S. political history. But the Southern strategy, the switching of working poor whites that had been the backbone of the party since Andrew Jackson, for middle-class urban and suburban social liberals, along a bedrock of votes for the pro-business Republican Party. That's the real trick for understanding the changes in the political parties in the last 40 years. It's not so much that the Democrats traded the white vote for the black vote, it's that Democrats traded poor whites for middle-class whites, while the wealthy, powerful but few in number, remained stalwartly Republican. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The switch to the third way was brought on by a series of electoral defeats. McGovern in 1972, Carter in 1980, Mondale's walloping in 84, and Dukakis in 1988. Jimmy Carter's win, by contrast, was a fluke, partly due to him being a Southerner, mostly due to Ford pardoning Nixon and getting blowback from that. McGovern in 72 lost on issues of crime and war, being seen as too sympathetic to the hippies. Carter in 1980 also lost on foreign policy, the rising price of gasoline due to the Arab oil embargoes and the Iranian hostage crisis, but he also lost on economics due to the so-called stagflation going on at the time. Walter Mondale in 84 famously lost every state but his home state of Minnesota and D.C., due to how the economy, which was in a bad recession early in Reagan's first term, had finally recovered from stagflation by 1984 and was roaring along, giving credence to neoliberal Republican economics that wouldn't be broken until the 2008 stock market crash. Dukakis' defeat in 1988 was also a heartbreaker for Democrats, as he had the polling lead for a good part of 88 until the Bush campaign deployed the infamous Willie Horton ad to portray Dukakis as soft on crime, using racism and anxiety about the great crime wave from the 70s through the 90s to score a win for Papa Bush. All of these defeats were answered by Bill Clinton, who corrected for what the Democrats had lost on. Clinton was laser-focused on kitchen table economics, not on big government economic stimulus, and skillfully downplaying race issues to white audiences, while playing up his own upbringing as a poor Southerner to rally poor black voters to his side. Clinton's reforms were an answer to Democrats' electoral weaknesses, but that came at a cost of de-emphasizing economic and racial justice, with things like welfare reform or the '94 crime bill. But because Clinton moderated on being tough on crime and economics, the party was able to make inroads with cultural liberals, eating into the GOP's traditional middle-class base, and this prevented the party from enduring future Mondale-scale ass-kickings, aided by the Republicans becoming more culturally extreme due to emphasizing fundamentalist Christianity. Gore and Kerry worked firmly in that Clinton-esque framework, but Barack Obama really sealed the deal on this new coalition. He was a cosmopolitan politician himself, a well-educated black man who had more of a reformer mindset, who was able to speak to the new affluent white voters, but also to really rally black voters and other voters of color. Although Obama governed more towards the left compared to how he ran, he was distinctly the product of the Clinton-era coalition, especially because he was able to still capture a decent number of poor white workers in old Union strongholds like Pennsylvania and the Midwest, whose loyalty was quietly an important part of what made the Clinton coalition work via the now infamous Blue Wall. Hillary Clinton was the last of this era, although she could be seen as a transitional candidate because the Democratic Party was already moving to the left, as shown by Bernie Sanders' strong showing in her primary and a lot of his platform planks being adopted by the Democratic National Convention that year. The Great Recession had weakened neoliberal economics, and the Obama presidency plus the Black Lives Matter movement put racial justice front and center. Those issues, along with immigration reform, were the keys behind Hillary's campaign in 2016, and had she won, I might have put the end date for the Clinton era there, but, you know.
And where do we go from here?
The new face of the Democratic Party is old, both literally and figuratively. Biden initially was elected in 1972 to the Senate, and what got him into there were his connections with the black community in Wilmington, Delaware, as he didn't really have any institutional support from the party at first. He tracked to the center with the party through the 80s and 90s, but then tacked back to the left under Obama, and now he's pushing the most ambitious social program since Lyndon Johnson through his Infrastructure and American Families plan. Part of what enabled this is the 2008 recession, but another part is the rising power of identity politics. Political polarization drags people who identify as one party or the other along with the party they identify with. Studies have shown that the white middle-class social liberals brought into the party in the Clinton era have become more liberal on other issues as time's gone by. And this is true for all of those urban and suburban cohorts. The Romney-Clinton voters were not just a one-time thing. They've stuck around for down-ballot races because they're not just never-Trumpers. They've become, in some way, progressive. A lot of this is premature to assert. In the future, the exact timing of when the Democrats switched from the third way to a more progressive orientation will probably be changed and debated, but it's pretty clear from the party platforms that the Democrats have embraced, from weed legalization, police reform, free community college, immigration reform, the return of big government spending, and that the Democrats are now moving past the fear that held them back in the Carter-Obama years, and are now looking towards the future, despite having a president who's the embodiment of the party's past. In conclusion, there are 9 phases for the Jeffersonians, just like there were for the Hamiltonians. Libertarian, populist, conservative, anti-corporatist, populist again, labor, social democratic, third way, and progressive. Between this video essay and the one before, you can see 2 trends that dominate the course of American politics: the evolving role of big business and the place of African Americans. The twists and turns of the two-party basically come from one of the two, showing a country that's not all identity politics and not all economics, one point where the U.S. can really claim to be unique on the world stage. Thank you all for sticking around through this 2-part series. Political science or history videos should be the second pillar of my channel after media analysis, at least until I get enough videos in the pipe to see what audience and/or the algorithm prefers. I have a few ideas spinning for what's up next. I have submitted for consideration to host a panel at KatsuCon 2022 as well, but the media side is definitely coming up next in one form or another. Thanks again.